Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if scientists should be more than just researchers and actually speak out about big issues like climate change? This new paper dives deep into that very question. So, scientists have always been involved in public life, right? Think about Rachel Carson and pesticides, or James Hansen warning about global warming. But lately, especially with climate change, we're seeing scientists getting much more visible and vocal. They're attending marches, joining protests, even doing civil disobedience. This paper is a review, so they looked at a bunch of other studies to try and figure out why scientists are doing this, what is stopping them, and what happens when they do speak out. The authors noticed that this isn't just new, it is increasingly prominent, it is happening at a time when science itself is sometimes questioned, and evidence seems to be ignored in politics. They mentioned the big March for Science event and the rise of groups like Scientist Rebellion. This whole trend is challenging the old idea that scientists should always be neutral and uninvolved in politics. A big part of the debate is about what happens when scientists step out of the lab. Does it hurt their credibility? Does it make people trust science less? Or is it actually necessary given the scale of the crises we face? It is a tricky balance. Scientists who do speak out can also face serious risks, damage to their reputation, harassment online, even legal trouble. But the urgency of climate change is pushing more and more scientists to take a stand. So, the review's main questions are, what makes scientists want to advocate for climate action or environmental issues? And what are the consequences of this advocacy on public trust, on the scientists themselves, and on what people believe? To figure this out, the researchers looked at lots of other studies, mostly from the last 10 years, that involve scientists discussing climate and environmental issues. They're not doing new experiments here, but gathering and organizing existing knowledge. They define climate advocacy pretty broadly to include anything from giving policy advice to participating in protests. Let's start with why scientists get involved. It's not just about wanting to save the planet, though that's a big part of it. Many scientists feel a moral duty. They see the evidence, they understand the risks, and they believe they have a responsibility to share that knowledge and push for action, especially when misinformation is spreading. They even talk about a moralized scientist identity where speaking out is seen as part of being a good scientist. Being part of groups like Scientist Rebellion or Scientists for Extinction Rebellion can also be really motivating. It creates a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. Seeing other scientists take action can make it feel more acceptable and less scary to step out themselves. Now, what about the barriers? Why don't all scientists speak out? Well, some are common to anyone talking publicly. Not enough time, not knowing how, or feeling like their efforts won't make a difference. But there are also barriers specific to being a scientist. A big one is the idea of scientific objectivity. Some scientists worry that advocacy conflicts with being seen as neutral and unbiased. They might not identify with activist cultures, or they worry about being seen as biased themselves. There is also the concern about epistemic trespassing, basically. Speaking authoritatively outside of your direct area of expertise. Another hurdle is feeling like they don't have the right skills or seniority for public action. And for early career scientists, there is a real fear of jeopardizing their future jobs or facing harassment. Some even worry that their own carbon footprint makes them a hypocrite if they talk about climate action. The whole political climate is a huge factor too. When science is politicized and when there is a lot of climate skepticism and misinformation, speaking out becomes riskier. In some places, simply defending science is an act of resistance. Okay, so we've covered the why and the why not. Now, for the big question, what actually happens when scientists advocate? This is where things get really interesting and a bit mixed. When it comes to the public, the effects on trust in scientists and science can be positive, negative, or even neutral. It really depends on a lot of things. Who is the scientist? What policy are they advocating for? Does the public already agree with that policy? For example, one study found that scientists advocating for strict sea or limits didn't change their credibility, but advocating for building more nuclear power reduced credibility. In another case, scientists advocating for a climate referendum that passed actually saw a slight increase in public trust, especially among people who already lean that way politically. How scientists present themselves also matters. If they seem to practice what they preach, meaning they live sustainably themselves, they tend to be seen as more credible. But if their lifestyle is seen as really out of sync with their message, that can hurt their reputation. Interestingly, sometimes being too perfectly sustainable can backfire, making scientists seem a bit preachy. What about more visible forms of activism, like protests and civil disobedience? The research here is also mixed. The March for Science seemed to polarize people's views about scientists in the US, but not necessarily their views on science itself. Some studies suggest that civil disobedience by climate scientists doesn't necessarily increase support for policies, but it also doesn't necessarily hurt perceived credibility. However, another experiment found that when a climate scientist explicitly called themselves an activist scientist, it significantly lowered their perceived reliability, especially for people on the right of the political spectrum. So, the takeaway here is that there is no one-size-fits-all answer. It is highly contextual. The effects are usually small, meaning advocacy rarely causes huge swings in public trust. But these more overt forms of activism might have different effects than simply sharing research. What about how other scientists see this? That's also debated. Some worry about politicizing research, while others think advocacy is crucial to protect science's authority. It seems scientists themselves have a range of views, from strongly opposed to actively engaged. Interestingly, many scientists believe that climate and environmental scientists in particular, should be more publicly engaged. And what about the scientists who do become advocates? For them, it can be a real tension between their role as a scientist and their role as a concerned citizen. Many reframe advocacy as an extension of their scientific responsibility. This can lead to a shift in identity, from scientist to scientist activist. They often develop new skills like public speaking and organizing, and many report feeling a renewed sense of purpose and solidarity. So, to wrap it up, this review really highlights that scientist climate advocacy is complex. It's not a single thing. The effectiveness and the impact depend on who the scientist is, what they say, how they say it, and the environment they're speaking into. The paper points out that the motivations are strong, a sense of duty, a need to defend science, and the sheer urgency of the climate crisis. But the barriers are real too, the fear of losing credibility, professional risks, and the polarized political landscape. And the effects they're varied, context-dependent, and often subtle. Sometimes increasing trust, sometimes decreasing it, and sometimes having no clear effect. It is a balancing act between speaking truth to power and maintaining the trust that science relies on. The authors suggest we need more research to understand these dynamics better, especially in different parts of the world, and how these actions affect not just individual scientists, but entire fields of science and science as an institution. What's my take on this? It is fascinating to see how scientists are grappling with this. On the one hand, the urgency of climate change is undeniable, and it's understandable why scientists who see the data firsthand would feel compelled to act. On the other hand, the paper is right to point out the potential risks to scientific credibility, which is so vital for informed decision-making. The key seems to be context, how a scientist communicates, who they are communicating with, and the specific issue they are addressing all seem to play a huge role in how their message is received. I think this research is super important because it reminds us that science isn't done in a vacuum. Scientists are people with values and concerns, and their role in society is evolving. We need to have these conversations about what a responsible and effective role for scientists in public discourse looks like, especially on issues as critical as climate change. It also makes me think about how we consume information. We need to be critically aware of who is speaking, why they are speaking, and how we are interpreting their messages. Future research could really explore how different forms of advocacy, from writing policy briefs to participating in peaceful protests, are perceived differently by various groups. And understanding the long-term career impacts on scientists who choose to be public advocates would also be incredibly valuable. What do you think? Should scientists be more outspoken on climate change? What are your thoughts on scientist activism? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown useful, please give this video a like. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the world of research. Thanks for watching.